Introduction. Albert Camus stands as perhaps the most honest philosopher of the 20th century's crisis of meaning. Where others sought systematic solutions or retreated into abstract theorizing, Camus confronted the fundamental contradiction of human existence with unflinching clarity. We desperately seek meaning in a universe that offers none. This wasn't philosophical pessimism, but rigorous analysis of what he termed the absurd condition, the collision between human need for purpose and the world's silent indifference. Unlike the existentialists with whom he's often grouped, Camus rejected the notion that we create meaning through radical freedom. He found such claims both dishonest and dangerous. Nor did he embrace traditional philosophy's systematic answers or religious consolation. Instead, he developed something entirely different, a philosophy that begins with honest recognition of meaninglessness and constructs an ethics of human dignity, precisely because the universe offers no foundation for it. Camus' philosophical vision emerged from lived experience rather than academic speculation. Born in colonial Algeria to a working-class family, he knew poverty, violence, and the moral complexities of empire firsthand. The Mediterranean light of his childhood, the tuberculosis that nearly killed him, the brutality of 2 world wars, and Algeria's struggle for independence, these weren't mere biographical details, but the raw material from which his philosophy crystallized. He understood that thinking about the human condition required grappling with actual human suffering, not abstract concepts. His complete philosophical contribution unfolds across 4 interconnected domains. First, the philosophy of the absurd provides precise analysis of why traditional sources of meaning collapse under honest scrutiny. Second, the ethics of revolt emerges from absurdist recognition, showing how acknowledgement of meaninglessness paradoxically generates commitment to human dignity. Third, his critique of totalitarian thinking exposes how both political and religious systems exploit human need for absolute answers. Finally, Mediterranean humanism offers an alternative to European nihilism, grounding ethics in human limits rather than transcendent claims. This philosophical journey moves logically from recognition through rebellion to wisdom. We'll trace how Camus' initial confrontation with suicide as philosophy's fundamental problem leads to his rejection of both literal and philosophical suicide, then to his development of revolt as the foundation for ethics and politics. Each stage builds inevitably on the previous, whilst maintaining rigorous internal coherence. Why does Camus matter today? Because he demonstrated how to live with dignity in a universe that offers no ultimate meaning or justice. He created a third way between despair and false hope that speaks directly to contemporary crises of meaning. In our age of collapsed certainties and resurgent authoritarianisms, his philosophy of limits and revolt provides essential guidance for maintaining human dignity without illusions. Part 1. The absurd condition, recognizing our fundamental situation. The absurd, for Camus, is not a mood or a philosophical opinion. It is a precise relationship. It describes the collision between 2 realities, our deep human need for rational meaning and the universe's complete silence in response to our questions. This is not pessimism, which judges the world as bad, nor nihilism, which declares nothing matters. The absurd is simply what emerges when we honestly confront the gap between what we seek and what we find. Consider the moment when you pause in the middle of a familiar routine and suddenly ask yourself why you're doing any of it. The alarm clock rings You dress, commute, work, return home, sleep, and repeat. But why? What ultimate purpose justifies this cycle? The question hangs in the air, receiving no answer from the world itself. This is not depression speaking, it's clarity. You've glimpsed the absurd condition that underlies all human existence. Camus understood that modernity has systematically stripped away the traditional answers to such questions. Religious certainty once provided cosmic purpose. Social hierarchy once defined our place. Nature itself once seemed to offer inherent meaning through divine design or natural law. But the 20th century, Camus's century of world wars, ideological collapse, and scientific materialism, has revealed these answers as human constructions rather than eternal truths. We find ourselves, perhaps for the first time in history, face to face with existence's fundamental groundlessness. The phenomenology of absurd recognition follows a distinctive pattern. It begins with those moments of strangeness that Camus describes so precisely, when familiar landscapes suddenly appear alien, when we catch sight of ourselves in a mirror and wonder at this stranger, when the telephone rings in an empty office and the sound seems to echo from nowhere into nothing. These are not symptoms of mental illness, but moments of acute perception. We see with startling clarity that our daily activities rest on no foundation more solid than habit and social agreement. This recognition differs fundamentally from temporary disillusionment or psychological depression. Depression distorts perception, making everything appear darker than it actually is. The absurd, by contrast, represents accurate perception of our actual existential situation. We are beings who desperately need meaning in a universe that offers none, not because the universe is malevolent, but because it simply exists without reference to our needs. The stars burn and planets orbit according to physical laws that have nothing to do with human purposes. This is not tragic, it is simply true. Once we achieve this recognition, we cannot return to unconscious living. The comfortable illusions that once sustained us have been permanently shattered, yet we must decide how to respond to this new awareness. We cannot unknow what we now know about our condition. The question becomes urgent. Given that we live in an absurd universe, how shall we live? This confrontation with meaninglessness is not the end of philosophy, but its true beginning. Revolt stands as Camus' first portrait of what it means to live without illusions. His radical honesty about his own emotional responses cuts through the elaborate performances that sustain social meaning. When his mother dies, he refuses to manufacture the grief that others expect. At the funeral, he observes the heat, the mourner's peculiar rituals, the weight of social expectation pressing upon him. He will not pretend to feelings he does not possess. This is not callousness, it is the brutal honesty of someone who has glimpsed the arbitrary nature of human significance. His relationship with Marie reveals the same unflinching authenticity. When she asks if he loves her, he responds that the word probably means nothing, but that he doesn't think so. When she proposes marriage, he agrees with indifference. It makes no difference to him whether they marry or not. These responses horrify because they strip away the romantic mythology that makes ordinary life bearable. Revolt refuses to participate in the collective pretense that these rituals carry inherent meaning. Society's reaction to his honesty exposes the violence underlying our need for shared illusions. The legal system that tries him becomes a ritual of meaning-making, desperate to transform his crime into something comprehensible within established moral categories. The prosecutor argues that Meursault's failure to cry at his mother's funeral proves his fundamental depravity, that anyone capable of such indifference must be capable of murder. This logic reveals how thoroughly social order depends upon performed emotions, upon the maintenance of certain feelings as sacred and unquestionable. The trial becomes absurd precisely because it seeks to impose significance upon actions that resist such interpretation. Meursault killed the Arab because of the sun, the heat, the weight of the moment, not from hatred, jealousy, or calculated malice. The court cannot accept this explanation because it offers no moral framework, no lesson, no meaning that can be extracted and applied. The legal system requires motivation, intention, moral categories that make sense of human action. Faced with genuine indifference, it must create the very evil it claims to punish. In his final confrontation with the chaplain, Meursault achieves his moment of absurd heroism. He rejects the priest's offer of salvation, his promise of meaning beyond death. He embraces his fate without false hope, accepting both his execution and the indifferent universe that permits it. This acceptance is not resignation but rebellion, the refusal to seek comfort in transcendent explanations that would diminish the stark reality of his condition. He opens himself to the benign indifference of the world, finding in that indifference not despair, but a strange form of freedom. This moment points toward the fuller development of absurd heroism that Camus will elaborate through Sisyphus, who transforms his eternal punishment into eternal defiance. The absurd announces itself not through philosophical argument, but through sudden moments of recognition that pierce our ordinary consciousness. Camus catalogues these experiences with startling precision in the Myth of Sisyphus. The morning when our usual routine, catching the same bus, greeting the same colleagues, performing the same tasks, suddenly appears as a theatrical performance in which we have forgotten our role. The mechanical gestures continue, but their meaning has evaporated. We see ourselves as if from outside, going through motions that no longer connect to any purpose we can genuinely affirm. These moments multiply once we begin noticing them. The stranger we glimpse in a telephone booth, caught in an unfamiliar gesture, becomes alien to us despite being ourselves. The natural world which we habitually experience as backdrop to human activity reveals what Camus calls its primitive hostility, not malevolent, but utterly indifferent to our projects and aspirations. Mountains, seas, and forests pursue their own logic, governed by forces that neither know nor care about human meaning. We recognize that we are temporary arrangements of matter in a universe that operated for billions of years without us and will continue long after we vanish. This alienation operates on multiple levels simultaneously. We discover ourselves estranged from the social environment we help create. The institutions, customs, and shared meanings that supposedly give life structure reveal themselves as arbitrary constructions, no more inherently meaningful than any alternative arrangement. Yet we cannot simply step outside these constructions. We remain embedded in them, dependent on them, even as we see through their claims to necessity or ultimate significance. Time transforms this alienation into urgency. Consciousness of mortality means that every human project unfolds against the backdrop of its own ultimate futility. We build careers, relationships, and legacies knowing they will end. The love that feels eternal is bounded by death. The art that aspires to permanence will crumble. The knowledge we accumulate will be forgotten. This is not pessimism, but accurate accounting. Time reveals that all human projects are races against meaninglessness, races we are destined to lose. The feeling of absurdity emerges from this collision between human need for meaning and the universe's refusal to provide it. We are creatures who demand reasons, purposes, and coherent narratives thrown into a reality that offers none. This is not a problem to be solved, but a fundamental condition to be recognized. The absurd is neither in us nor in the world, but in their confrontation in the gap between what we seek and what we find. Yet Camus insists on distinguishing between the feeling of absurdity and its philosophical analysis. The initial emotional recognition, that moment of seeing through our usual assumptions, must be developed into clear thinking about our condition and appropriate responses. Many people experience these moments of recognition, but quickly retreat into familiar patterns of thought and behavior. They treat the feeling as temporary disorientation rather than genuine insight. This retreat is understandable, but philosophically dishonest. Once we have seen clearly, we face a fundamental choice point. We can flee back into unconsciousness, pretending the recognition never occurred. We can escape through false solutions, religious faith, political ideology, or philosophical systems that promise to restore meaning through external authority. Or we can face the implications honestly and develop an authentic response to our situation. The authentic response begins with refusing both escape and despair. Having recognized the absurd condition, we neither deny it nor surrender to it. Instead, we acknowledge it as the starting point for a different kind of life, one that creates value through revolt against meaninglessness rather than submission to false meanings. This recognition becomes the foundation for everything that follows in Camus's philosophy: the rejection of suicide, the ethics of rebellion, and the construction of human solidarity in face of cosmic indifference. Part 2, Philosophical Suicide, the False Escapes from Absurdity. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. This stark declaration opens Camus's Times, the Myth of Sisyphus *, cutting through centuries of metaphysical speculation to confront the most urgent question any conscious being faces. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. Everything else, whether the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer. Why does this question emerge with such logical inevitability? Once we recognize life's fundamental absurdity, the collision between human need for meaning and the universe's silent indifference, the question of continuation becomes unavoidable. If existence offers no inherent purpose, no transcendent justification, no ultimate validation, then what rational grounds exist for persisting? The absurd condition strips away comfortable illusions about cosmic significance, divine purpose, or progressive meaning, leaving consciousness confronted with its own apparent superfluity. Yet Camus distinguishes carefully between literal suicide and what he terms philosophical suicide, the escape from absurdity through false solutions that destroy the very questioning consciousness that defines human dignity. Philosophical suicide occurs when we flee into religious faith, ideological certainty, or systematic philosophy that claims to resolve the absurd contradiction. These escapes kill something essential, the lucid recognition of our condition that makes us authentically human. They represent a different kind of death, the death of intellectual honesty and rebellious consciousness. The question of suicide thus tests whether life remains worth living without external props or transcendent consolations. It demands we confront existence stripped of comforting myths, facing the raw facts of being thrown into a world that offers no inherent welcome or explanation for our presence. This confrontation with meaninglessness could logically lead to the conclusion that continuation serves no purpose, that the rational response to absurdity is simply to cease participating in it. But Camus's genius lies in recognizing that this question, whilst genuinely urgent, opens rather than closes philosophical inquiry. The very fact that we can formulate the question, that consciousness can step back and evaluate its own worth, reveals something remarkable about human existence. We possess the capacity for revolt against our condition, for creating meaning through our rebellion against meaninglessness, for asserting human dignity precisely in the face of cosmic indifference. The fundamental question, therefore, becomes not whether to live, but how to live once we've recognized the absurd character of existence. Camus's entire philosophical project develops as a systematic response to this challenge, making his work essentially practical philosophy aimed at discovering authentic reasons for continuation. The question of suicide transforms into the question of how to live fully whilst maintaining lucid awareness of life's ultimate groundlessness, how to embrace existence without false hopes or comforting delusions. This transforms philosophy from academic exercise into existential necessity, from abstract speculation into urgent practical wisdom for beings who must choose, moment by moment, whether their existence justifies itself. The most seductive escape from absurdity comes disguised as profundity itself. Søren Kierkegaard, that tormented Danish thinker who first mapped the contours of existential despair, offered what appears to be the most honest confrontation with meaninglessness, only to retreat at the crucial moment into what Camus recognizes as the ultimate betrayal of human consciousness. Kierkegaard begins with unflinching clarity. He sees the fundamental contradiction between human need for meaning and the universe's silence. He acknowledges that reason cannot bridge this gap, that logic leads only to despair when confronted with existence's ultimate questions. But then, precisely when intellectual courage demands we live with this tension, Kierkegaard performs his famous leap not into the void, but into faith. This leap represents the paradigmatic flight from absurdity. Rather than accepting the permanent tension between human questioning and cosmic silence, Kierkegaard leaps into religious commitment that transcends rational justification entirely. Faith becomes the solution that dissolves the absurd by asserting another realm where contradictions resolve, where human suffering finds ultimate purpose, where our desperate questions receive eternal answers. The psychological appeal proves overwhelming. Religious escape offers complete resolution, not merely hope, but certainty about ultimate meaning. It transforms the absurd condition from permanent human reality into temporary testing ground. Death becomes transition rather than termination. Suffering becomes meaningful rather than arbitrary. The universe's silence becomes temporary rather than eternal. Christianity, particularly in its existentialist formulations, exemplifies this sophisticated escape. Thinkers like Karl Jaspers and Gabriel Marcel begin with genuine insights into human limitations and existential anxiety. They acknowledge the breakdown of traditional certainties, the experience of being thrown into existence without clear purpose or direction. But having diagnosed the human condition, With remarkable accuracy, they then leap to transcendent solutions that betray their initial insights. Jaspers speaks of boundary situations that reveal human finitude, then posits transcendence as the answer to what he has just shown to be the permanent human condition. Marcel explores the mystery of existence and human relationships, then resolves this mystery through religious faith that claims access to ultimate reality. Both thinkers perform the same movement, honest diagnosis followed by transcendent cure. Camus identifies this pattern as philosophical suicide because it requires sacrificing precisely what makes the analysis valuable: intellectual honesty about reality's actual character. Faith demands we ignore the evidence of our senses, the testimony of reason, the lived experience of absurdity that initially motivated the entire philosophical investigation. The leap of faith kills the very questioning consciousness that defines human dignity. It trades authentic uncertainty for false certainty about ultimate meaning. Where absurdity demands we live with unresolved tension, faith provides premature resolution. Where honest thinking requires we acknowledge the limits of human knowledge, religious escape claims access to absolute truth. This represents philosophical suicide in its purest form. Not the crude abandonment of thinking, but thinking that commits suicide by leaping beyond the evidence into transcendent realms that cannot be verified or challenged. Faith becomes the murder weapon turned against the mind that wielded it, killing the critical consciousness that made the initial insights possible. Camus recognizes the profound appeal of this solution, whilst rejecting its fundamental dishonesty. The leap of faith offers everything the absurd condition denies: meaning, purpose, resolution, hope. But it purchases these comforts through intellectual suicide, abandoning the very human capacity for honest questioning that religion claims to honor. The systematic philosopher presents himself as the most rigorous opponent of absurdity. Where the religious believer leaps beyond reason, the architect of comprehensive systems claims to work entirely within its bounds. Hegel promises that reality itself is rational, that what appears contradictory or meaningless to finite understanding reveals its necessity when grasped by absolute knowledge. The entire universe becomes a logical system, where every element finds its proper place, where even suffering and death serve the development of absolute spirit. This appears more honest than religious faith it claims to demonstrate, rather than simply assert the ultimate meaningfulness of existence. Yet this apparent honesty conceals a deeper dishonesty. The systematic philosopher achieves his comprehensive vision only by abstracting from the very experience that generates the absurd condition. When Hegel treats individual death as merely a moment in spirit's self-development, he performs the same leap as the religious believer, not beyond reason, but beyond human perspective itself. The lived experience of mortality, the concrete fact of suffering, the irreducible particularity of individual existence, all this dissolves into the movement of absolute knowledge. The system succeeds in explaining everything, precisely because it explains away what matters most to human consciousness. The rational system commits philosophical suicide as surely as religious faith. It sacrifices the human standpoint that recognizes absurdity for the illusion of a perspective that transcends human limitations entirely. The systematic philosopher claims to think from the standpoint of the absolute, to grasp reality as it truly is, rather than as it appears to finite consciousness. But this claim itself represents an escape from the human condition rather than an honest confrontation with it. The very comprehensiveness that makes these systems appear as solutions reveals their falsity to lived experience. Camus recognizes that the appeal of rational systems lies precisely in their promise to overcome the partiality and limitation of human perspective. They offer the seductive possibility of absolute knowledge that would render the absurd condition merely apparent rather than real. But human consciousness remains irreducibly finite, bound to a perspective that cannot encompass the totality these systems claim to grasp. The attempt to think from an absolute standpoint represents not the fulfillment of reason, but its betrayal, a denial of the conditions under which human reasoning actually occurs. The systematic escape thus becomes another form of suicide, trading the authentic recognition of absurdity for the false comfort of absolute knowledge. The philosopher who constructs comprehensive systems has not solved the problem of meaninglessness, but simply refused to acknowledge it. He has chosen the security of systematic explanation over the courage required to live without ultimate justification, to accept the human condition rather than transcend it through rational artifice. The most seductive form of philosophical suicide presents itself not as religious transcendence or rational system building, but as political hope. Here lies perhaps the most dangerous escape from absurdity, because it masquerades as engagement with the world whilst actually fleeing from immediate reality into the comfortable certainty of future redemption. Political ideologies promise what religion once offered, ultimate meaning through eventual salvation. The difference lies only in location salvation moves from heaven to history, from eternity to the revolutionary future. Marxism becomes Christianity without God. Fascism becomes mysticism without mystery. Both demand the same fundamental betrayal: sacrifice present reality for future promise, treat living persons as instruments for abstract humanity's eventual triumph. Camus recognized this pattern with devastating clarity in his critique of revolutionary thinking. The communist intellectual justifies present terror through future justice. The fascist justifies present brutality through racial destiny. Each ideology transforms hope itself into an instrument of murder. When we hope for the perfect society, we necessarily devalue imperfect persons. When we work toward ultimate justice, we justify immediate injustice. The revolutionary who executes enemies of the people serves the same psychological function as the believer who accepts divine will, both escape the intolerable burden of present suffering through faith in eventual resolution. This represents philosophical suicide because it kills consciousness of the actual world in favor of an imagined world that will never arrive. The Marxist revolutionary lives not in the present moment of concrete human suffering, but in the theoretical future where class struggle resolves into perfect harmony. The fascist lives not among actual diverse persons, but in the mythical community of purified race or nation. Both have murdered their capacity to see what stands before them. The political escape proves particularly insidious because it appears to embrace human solidarity whilst actually destroying it. Revolutionary ideology claims to serve humanity by sacrificing humans, claims to create justice by perpetrating injustice, claims to establish freedom through tyranny. Camus saw through this dialectical sleight of hand. Any system that treats present persons as means to future ends has already betrayed the human dignity it claims to serve. The absurd condition offers no such comfort. It provides no historical guarantee, no inevitable progress, no ultimate resolution. It demands we face the immediate reality of suffering without the consolation of eventual meaning. This proves unbearable for revolutionary consciousness, which requires the drug of hope to function. But hope, Camus understood, becomes the enemy of revolt when it shifts attention from present injustice to future justice, from actual persons to abstract humanity. True revolt begins when we abandon hope for ultimate solutions and commit ourselves to immediate human dignity. It chooses present solidarity over future salvation, concrete persons over abstract principles, the reality of suffering over the promise of its eventual elimination. Part 3. Living the Absurd. Revolt, Freedom, and Passion. The absurd man arrives at a crossroads. Having recognized the fundamental discord between his need for unity and the world's unreasonable silence, he faces a choice that will determine everything that follows. He can surrender to this recognition, allowing it to crush his spirit into resignation, or he can transform it into something entirely different. Camus calls this transformation revolt. Not the political upheaval we might expect, but something far more fundamental and personal. Revolt begins with a simple but profound refusal. The absurd man says no, not to the absurd condition itself, which remains unchangeable, but to the conclusions others draw from it. He refuses to accept that meaninglessness justifies surrender. He refuses to let the absence of ultimate purpose drain life of its immediate value. Most crucially, he refuses to seek escape through the false solutions that promise to restore meaning through transcendent beliefs or systematic philosophies that claim to resolve the tension between human longing and cosmic silence. This refusal creates a peculiar kind of strength. The absurd man maintains the very tension that others flee. Where the religious believer dissolves the tension through faith and the nihilist collapses it through despair, the absurd man holds both sides in permanent opposition. He acknowledges his powerlessness to create ultimate meaning while simultaneously asserting his power to create immediate value. He accepts that death renders all achievements temporary, whilst insisting that this temporariness does not diminish their worth. Revolt emerges from recognizing our limitations, yet it refuses to accept these limitations as final verdicts on human dignity. The absurd man knows he cannot overcome the absurd, but he will not be overcome by it. He cannot create lasting meaning, but he will not stop creating temporary meanings. He cannot defeat death, but he will not let death defeat life. This stance requires constant vigilance, for the temptations to escape remain powerful, the comfort of belief, the relief of despair, the seduction of systems that promise to explain everything. The paradox runs deeper still. Revolt draws its strength precisely from the powerlessness it acknowledges. Because the absurd man expects no ultimate victory, he cannot be ultimately defeated. Because he seeks no final answers, he cannot be silenced by unanswerable questions. Because he builds no permanent structures of meaning, he cannot be crushed when such structures collapse. His revolt is invulnerable because it demands nothing that the world might refuse to give. This revolt becomes the foundation upon which everything else must be built. It establishes the absurd man's fundamental stance toward existence, neither surrender nor escape, but engagement without illusion. From this position, he can begin to explore what authentic living might mean. He can discover the freedom that comes from having no master and the passion that emerges when every moment carries the full weight of a life that will not last forever. Revolt does not solve the absurd. It transforms the absurd into the very ground of human dignity. The recognition of absurdity appears, at first glance, to annihilate human freedom entirely. If our choices carry no ultimate weight, If our projects dissolve into meaninglessness against the backdrop of an indifferent universe, then what distinguishes one action from another? The absurd seems to render all possibilities equivalent, and equivalence surely is the enemy of meaningful choice. When nothing matters, ultimately, how can anything matter at all? This apparent paradox strikes at the heart of human agency itself. Yet Camus reveals that absurdity accomplishes precisely the opposite. It liberates us by destroying the false obligations and imaginary purposes that had previously constrained our action. The recognition that there is no predetermined essence to fulfill, no cosmic plan to serve, no transcendent authority to obey, sweeps away the elaborate scaffolding of external validation that had limited our possibilities. We discover that we had been imprisoned not by genuine constraints, but by illusions of necessity. The duties we thought absolute, the roles we believed essential to our identity, the purposes we imagined written into the fabric of reality, all these dissolve under absurdity's clear light. This liberation operates within unmistakable limits, but becomes unlimited within those bounds. Mortality remains absolute. We cannot choose to live forever. Circumstance constrains us. We cannot remake the world according to our desires. Human nature itself provides boundaries. We cannot transcend the fundamental conditions of our existence. But within these parameters, which are real, not imaginary, freedom becomes total. Every choice becomes genuinely ours. Every action flows from our own decision rather than from external compulsion disguised as duty. Consider Camus's actor, who embodies this liberated existence perfectly. He plays multiple roles without confusing any single performance with his ultimate identity. Tonight he is Hamlet, tomorrow Lear, next week a contemporary businessman, each role inhabited fully, yet none mistaken for his essential self. The actor understands that identity is performance, not discovery, and this understanding frees him to explore the full range of human possibility without the paralyzing fear of betraying some predetermined nature. His freedom lies precisely in recognizing that there is no authentic self to betray. The conqueror provides another model of absurd freedom. He acts decisively, commits himself completely to his campaigns, yet harbors no illusions about permanent victory. He knows that his conquest will crumble, that his empire will fall, that history will forget his name, and this knowledge liberates rather than paralyzes him. Freed from the impossible burden of achieving lasting significance, he can act with complete intensity in the present moment. His freedom emerges from accepting the temporary nature of all human achievement. This represents a fundamental shift in how we understand liberation itself. Traditional concepts of freedom sought to transcend limitations to achieve the infinite, the eternal, the absolute. But such transcendence would destroy human nature rather than fulfill it. True liberation comes through accepting rather than escaping our finite condition. We find freedom not by seeking impossible infinity, but by embracing the specific constraints that define human existence. The absurd person discovers that freedom within limits is not compromised freedom, but the only freedom available to creatures like ourselves, and that this bounded freedom is sufficient for a fully human life. The absurd man discovers something remarkable in his liberation from eternal significance. Passion becomes possible precisely when it no longer needs to justify itself through duration or cosmic importance. Camus reveals how accepting meaninglessness paradoxically intensifies rather than diminishes our capacity for engagement with life. When we abandon the exhausting search for experiences that matter in some ultimate sense, we free enormous energy for experiences that matter intensely in the immediate sense. This represents a fundamental shift in how we measure the value of our choices and engagements. Traditional ethics and philosophy often privilege experiences that promise permanence, universal significance, or connection to eternal truths. The absurd man inverts this hierarchy entirely. He seeks not the experience that will matter forever, but the experience that matters completely now. Not the love that transcends time, but the love that fills time. Not the work that achieves immortal significance, but the work that achieves total engagement. Camus illustrates this through his image of the absurd man as actor. The actor embodies multiple roles, lives, countless lives, experiences the full range of human possibility, yet never confuses any single role with his ultimate identity. He knows that tomorrow he will inhabit a different character, embrace different passions, explore different possibilities. This knowledge doesn't diminish his commitment to today's role, it intensifies it. Because he knows this performance is temporary, he can give himself to it completely without the burden of making it eternal. The actor becomes Camus's model for absurd passion because he demonstrates how accepting the ephemeral nature of experience liberates us for fuller engagement with experience. The traditional approach demands that our passions prove their worth through permanence or universal significance. We hesitate to commit fully to relationships, projects, or experiences unless we can convince ourselves they matter in some cosmic sense. This hesitation drains passion of its intensity. The absurd man recognizes this hesitation as another form of philosophical suicide, the refusal to live fully in the present because the present cannot guarantee eternal meaning. He chooses instead to embrace what Camus calls the quantity of experience over its supposed quality, when quality is measured by external standards of significance. But this quantity becomes its own quality, the quality of intensity, immediacy, complete presence. This passionate engagement becomes possible only through the revolt that refuses despair, the freedom that enables choice, and the acceptance that removes the burden of eternal justification. The absurd man's passion is not desperate or frantic. It is lucid and complete. He knows his experiences will end, his relationships will conclude, his projects will finish. This knowledge doesn't diminish his engagement, it purifies it. He loves not because love is eternal, but because love is intense. He creates not because his creations will endure, but because creation fills him completely. Camus shows how this passionate intensity connects directly to the other consequences of absurd living. Revolt makes passion possible by refusing the despair that would drain energy from engagement. Freedom enables passionate choice by removing the paralysis of seeking eternally correct decisions. And passion justifies both revolt and freedom by demonstrating that life without ultimate meaning can still be life lived with complete intensity. The absurd man's passion becomes both consequence and vindication of his philosophical position, proof that accepting meaninglessness opens rather than closes the possibility of profound engagement with existence. Part 4. The Myth of Sisyphus, Embracing Eternal Struggle. The gods possessed a perfect understanding of human nature when they devised Sisyphus's punishment. They knew that for a conscious being, there exists no more dreadful torment than futile and hopeless labor. This was not arbitrary cruelty, but calculated precision, a punishment crafted specifically for creatures capable of recognizing their own predicament. The eternal rolling of the boulder up the mountain represents the most refined torture imaginable, work that consciousness knows to be meaningless, yet cannot abandon. Consider the genius of this divine justice. Physical pain eventually dulls the senses. Even death provides escape, but conscious futility offers no such relief. Sisyphus must push his rock knowing it will roll back down, must climb the mountain aware that his effort achieves nothing permanent, must repeat this cycle whilst fully comprehending its absurdity. The gods understood that consciousness creates demands for progress, for meaning, for achievement that make futility genuinely unbearable. Without awareness, the task would merely be mechanical repetition. With awareness, it becomes existential torment. This punishment mirrors the human condition with unsettling precision. We labor through our days, knowing that death will ultimately claim all our achievements. We build civilizations that will crumble, create art that will be forgotten, form relationships that must end. Like Sisyphus, we possess the consciousness that recognizes this predicament whilst being unable to escape it. We cannot choose unconsciousness, cannot abandon the effort, cannot transcend our situation through will alone. The tragedy lies not in the labor itself, but in the consciousness that accompanies it. Sisyphus suffers because he knows the futility, knows the repetition, knows that his rock will never stay atop the mountain. This knowledge transforms physical effort into metaphysical anguish. The gods crafted a punishment that exploits the very faculty that makes us human, our capacity for understanding. They turned consciousness against itself, making awareness the instrument of torment. Yet this consciousness also contains the seeds of something the gods perhaps did not anticipate. The same awareness that recognizes futility also possesses the power to choose its response to that recognition. Sisyphus knows his situation completely, and in that complete knowledge lies both his torment and his potential liberation. The myth becomes Camus's central metaphor because it captures the essential structure of existence, conscious effort in an indifferent universe that offers no ultimate justification, yet consciousness itself as the source of whatever meaning we might create. In the endless cycle of Sisyphus's punishment, there exists one moment that transforms everything, not the straining ascent, not the crushing descent of the boulder, but the walk back down the mountain. Here, in this brief interval between futile labors, consciousness awakens. Camus identifies this moment as the pivot upon which the entire meaning of the myth turns, for it is precisely when Sisyphus becomes fully aware of his condition that he transcends it. This descent represents more than mere physical movement. It constitutes the space where lucidity emerges. Sisyphus walks knowing exactly what awaits him, another ascent, another failure, another eternal repetition. Yet this knowledge, rather than crushing him further, becomes the foundation of his dignity. The gods designed his punishment to be perfectly futile, believing that nothing could be more dreadful than hopeless labor. They calculated without the transformative power of consciousness itself. The moment of awareness reveals the fundamental paradox of the human condition. Consciousness of absurdity simultaneously creates suffering and dignity, despair and greatness. Sisyphus suffers because he knows, he understands the futility completely, grasps the endless repetition, recognizes the absence of ultimate meaning or redemption. Yet this very knowledge elevates him above his punishment. Where the gods intended degradation, Consciousness creates a form of superiority that no external force can touch. This lucid recognition becomes the source of a specifically human greatness. Sisyphus achieves tragic heroism not despite his awareness, but through it. His consciousness refuses the comfort of illusion, the escape of false hope, or the numbness of unconscious repetition. Instead, he embraces the full reality of his situation whilst maintaining his humanity intact. The punishment remains unchanged, but its meaning transforms completely through this act of conscious acknowledgement. The gods' miscalculation reveals something profound about human nature. They assumed that awareness of futility would compound the torment, making the punishment unbearable. Instead, consciousness becomes the very mechanism by which the punishment loses its power to degrade. Sisyphus may be condemned to eternal labour, but he cannot be condemned to unconsciousness of his condition. This awareness, this refusal to be diminished by circumstances beyond his control, constitutes his revolt against the absurd. In this moment of dissent, Sisyphus embodies the human response to absurd conditions. He demonstrates that whilst we cannot escape the fundamental contradictions of existence, we can choose how to meet them. Consciousness becomes both the source of our recognition of life's absurdity and the foundation of our dignity in facing it. The moment of awareness transforms what was intended as pure punishment into the basis for authentic human response to an indifferent universe. The most startling moment in Camus's entire philosophical project arrives not with dramatic revelation, but with quiet insistence. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. This declaration transforms everything that precedes it. The eternal punishment becomes something else entirely, not despite its endlessness, but because of it. Sisyphus achieves happiness not by escaping his condition, but by embracing it so completely that the distinction between freedom and bondage dissolves. This happiness emerges from a profound shift in perspective. Sisyphus no longer pushes the boulder whilst dreaming of completion or cursing the gods. He pushes because pushing has become his authentic expression of revolt against meaninglessness. The rock's inevitable descent no longer represents failure but opportunity, another chance to assert his defiance, another moment to choose engagement over despair. Each return down the mountain becomes a walk of contemplation, a space where consciousness fully grasps its situation without illusion. The struggle itself provides meaning without requiring external validation. Sisyphus finds satisfaction not in achieving permanent victory over the rock, but in the quality of his engagement with the task. His muscles strain, his mind focuses, his will asserts itself against cosmic indifference, and this assertion becomes sufficient. The meaning lies not in the destination, but in the journey, not in the outcome, but in the integrity of the effort itself. This represents joy found through complete acceptance of existence on its own terms rather than our preferred terms. Sisyphus no longer demands that reality conform to his desires for permanence, progress, or ultimate resolution. Instead, he discovers fulfillment in working with the materials actually available: stone, mountain, gravity, time, his own mortal strength. The happiness comes from this alignment between expectation and reality, between human effort and cosmic conditions. Yet this happiness is not resignation or consolation, but active affirmation. Sisyphus does not accept his fate passively, but transforms it through the quality of his response. His happiness becomes a form of revolt, not against the task itself, but against the assumption that meaninglessness equals misery. He demonstrates that consciousness can create value through engagement even when external purposes remain absent. This culminates Camus' vision of absurd living, revolt expressed through acceptance that maintains creative tension without false resolution. Sisyphus embodies the absurd hero who lives fully within human limits whilst refusing to surrender human dignity. His happiness represents neither escape nor defeat, but the discovery of authentic existence within the boundaries of the human condition, passionate, defiant, and ultimately sufficient unto itself. Part 5. From Individual to Collective. The Ethics of Revolt. When Camus first confronted the absurd, it appeared as a deeply personal crisis, the individual mind colliding with an indifferent universe, creating that peculiar divorce between human need for meaning and the world's stubborn silence. Yet, as his philosophy developed, something remarkable occurred. What seemed like the most isolating philosophical position imaginable revealed itself as the foundation for the most profound human solidarity. The transformation begins with a crucial recognition. The absurd is not merely my psychological condition, but the shared situation of conscious beings everywhere. Every person who achieves lucid awareness discovers the same fundamental contradiction, the gap between human longing for rational explanation and reality's refusal to provide it. This universality of the absurd condition creates what Camus calls the first evidence of human solidarity. We are united not by shared beliefs or common purposes, but by our common predicament. This insight transforms Descartes' foundational principle. Where the philosopher of method proclaimed, "I think, therefore I am," Camus offers something far more revolutionary. I rebel, therefore we exist. The very act of revolt, that fundamental refusal to accept the absurd, quietly reveals human nature as essentially collective. When I say no to absurdity, I simultaneously affirm something about human dignity in general. My revolt speaks not just for myself, but for the human condition itself. The discovery changes everything about what revolt means. Initially, revolt appeared as pure negation, the individual's refusal to surrender to meaninglessness or seek false consolation in philosophical systems that promise ultimate answers. But through this negation, something positive emerges. To rebel against absurdity is to assert that human consciousness has value, that the demand for meaning matters even when it cannot be satisfied. This assertion cannot remain purely personal without contradiction. Consider the logic carefully. If my revolt against absurdity affirms only my individual worth, then I implicitly deny the same worth to others who share my condition. But the absurd reveals no fundamental differences between conscious beings. We all face the same essential situation. Therefore, authentic revolt must affirm human dignity universally. The rebel discovers that in defending his own consciousness against absurdity, he defends consciousness itself. This transformation occurs without requiring transcendent moral commands or absolute values. The ethics emerging from revolt remains thoroughly human, grounded in our actual condition rather than imposed from outside. We discover obligations to others not because God commands them or because reason demands them, but because revolt itself reveals these obligations as inherent in the human situation. The absurd condition, far from preventing moral action, becomes its most solid foundation. The rebel thus finds himself responsible for others in ways he never anticipated. His revolt creates solidarity, not through shared ideology, but through shared recognition of our common predicament. This solidarity remains precarious, always threatened by the temptation to escape into false absolutes or to deny the humanity of those who seem different. Yet it provides the only authentic basis for ethics. In an absurd world, not the certainty of moral truth, but the recognition of our mutual vulnerability to meaninglessness and our common dignity in facing it consciously. The recognition of the absurd condition creates something unexpected, a profound solidarity among all those who see clearly. When we understand that consciousness confronts an indifferent universe, that death renders all human projects ultimately meaningless, that no transcendent purpose validates our existence, we discover we are not alone in this predicament. Every human being who has ever lived has faced this same fundamental situation. The businessman rushing to his meeting, the artist struggling with her canvas, the philosopher writing in solitude, all participate in the same essential drama of consciousness seeking meaning in a universe that offers none. The shared condition generates genuine ethical obligations without requiring external commands or abstract principles. The solidarity of the condemned emerges not from philosophical theory, but from recognition of common vulnerability. When I understand that my neighbour faces the same absurd situation, I do the same confrontation with mortality, the same search for meaning in meaninglessness, the same burden of consciousness, I cannot remain indifferent to his suffering. His pain becomes mine, not through sentimental identification, but through clear recognition that we inhabit the same existential territory. To increase his suffering would be to attack the very consciousness that makes revolt possible, to diminish the dignity that represents our only authentic response to the absurd. This solidarity differs fundamentally from Christian universal love or political ideological unity. It requires no transcendent validation, no future utopia, no abstract principle of human worth. Instead, it emerges from immediate, concrete recognition of shared experience. The Christian loves his neighbour because God commands it. The revolutionary sacrifices individuals for future humanity. But the person who understands the absurd recognizes solidarity as an inevitable consequence of clear sight. When we see that all humans are condemned to consciousness, condemned to seek meaning whilst knowing none exists, condemned to face death whilst loving life, we cannot help but recognize kinship. The ethics of revolt must therefore oppose whatever increases human suffering or diminishes human dignity, not because suffering violates abstract moral laws, but because it attacks the very condition that makes revolt meaningful. The torturer destroys not merely his victim's body, but the consciousness that could potentially recognize and rebel against the absurd. The tyrant eliminates not merely political opposition, but the dignity that represents humanity's authentic response to meaninglessness. Every act that reduces a human being to mere object, that denies the consciousness that defines our condition, that increases the suffering inherent in existence, directly contradicts the revolt that gives life its only possible meaning. This creates concrete ethical imperatives. We must defend human dignity, not because it serves abstract justice, but because dignity represents the conscious recognition of our condition. We must oppose cruelty, not because it violates divine commands, but because it attacks the consciousness that makes revolt possible. We must work for human flourishing, not because progress is guaranteed, but because flourishing allows more people to achieve the lucid recognition that transforms absurdity into meaning through rebellion. Revolt discovers its own boundaries through its very nature. The consciousness that recognizes absurdity and chooses defiance cannot coherently destroy itself or eliminate the consciousness of others. These limits emerge not from external moral commands, but from revolt's internal logic, from what it means to affirm human dignity in an indifferent universe. Murder represents the ultimate betrayal of revolt's founding insight. When we recognize our absurd condition, we discover that consciousness itself possesses irreplaceable value. This awareness creates solidarity with all who share the human predicament. To kill another person destroys the very thing that makes revolt possible and meaningful, the conscious being who can recognize absurdity and choose defiance. Murder eliminates dignity rather than affirming it, contradicting revolt's essential purpose. The murderer claims knowledge that revolt explicitly rejects, absolute certainty about human worth. Authentic revolt emerges from recognizing our fundamental ignorance about ultimate meaning, yet murder requires the arrogant assumption that one consciousness matters less than another. This assumption transforms revolt into its opposite, a claim to absolute knowledge that justifies unlimited action. The revolutionary who kills for the cause betrays the modesty that authentic revolt demands. Suicide presents a different but equally fundamental betrayal. The person who recognizes absurdity yet chooses self-destruction abandons the shared struggle that gives revolt its meaning. Suicide denies the value discovered through revolt itself, the worth of consciousness persisting despite meaninglessness. More crucially, it breaks solidarity with others who face the same condition. Revolt creates bonds between conscious beings confronting absurdity together. Suicide severs these bonds through ultimate withdrawal. The logic runs deeper than individual choice. Revolt affirms that consciousness has value precisely because it can recognize and defy absurdity. Suicide treats this consciousness as disposable, contradicting the fundamental insight that sparked revolt. The person who chooses death after recognizing absurdity makes revolt meaningless. If consciousness facing absurdity lacks sufficient worth to preserve, then revolt itself becomes pointless gesture rather than meaningful affirmation. These limits reveal revolt's essential character. Unlike ideological systems that impose external rules, authentic revolt generates its own constraints through honest recognition of what it actually involves. The rebel who truly understands revolt's nature cannot coherently choose murder or suicide because these actions destroy what revolt seeks to protect and affirm. This internal logic points toward broader political implications. If revolt must reject both murder and suicide, then revolutionary movements that embrace unlimited violence betray revolt's authentic spirit. The political philosophy, emerging from absurd recognition, must maintain essential modesty, refusing absolute claims that justify any means necessary. True revolt preserves consciousness and dignity, rather than sacrificing them for abstract ideals or ultimate solutions. Part 6. The Rebel: Historical Forms of Revolt. The metaphysical rebel begins with an act of profound moral clarity. Consider Ivan Karamazov confronting his brother Alyosha with the fundamental scandal of innocent suffering. A child tortured by adults, what cosmic justice could possibly justify this horror? What divine plan makes such agony necessary? Ivan's rebellion emerges not from philosophical speculation, but from an immediate visceral recognition that no theodicy, however sophisticated, can transform genuine evil into hidden good. The rebels know thunders against any system that would explain away or justify the suffering of innocence. This refusal represents more than mere negation. When Ivan rejects God's moral order, he simultaneously affirms something essential about human dignity and moral intuition. The rebel discovers that certain values, compassion, justice, the protection of innocence, matter more than cosmic harmony or divine authority. In rejecting a universe that permits meaningless cruelty, the metaphysical rebel paradoxically creates meaning through the very intensity of rejection. The rebel's no becomes a yes to human moral standards that refuse to bow before claims of higher necessity. Yet here lies the treacherous path that metaphysical rebellion must navigate. The rebel, who begins by rejecting false absolutes, faces the constant temptation to create new ones. Having dethroned God, the rebel risks becoming God, claiming perfect knowledge of justice, constructing ideal systems that brook no opposition. The authentic insight that sparked rebellion recognition of human limitations and the horror of innocent suffering becomes forgotten in the intoxication of absolute moral certainty. This transformation reveals itself throughout history, in revolutionary movements that began with genuine moral outrage but ended in tyranny. The rebel who once wept for suffering children now justifies new forms of suffering in service of the perfect society. The no that once protected human dignity becomes a yes to ideological purity that crushes actual humans beneath abstract ideals. The metaphysical rebel has become the very thing originally rebelled against an absolute authority that claims to justify present suffering through future perfection. The authentic metaphysical rebel must therefore maintain perpetual vigilance against this corruption. True rebellion preserves its original tension between rejection and affirmation without resolving it through false synthesis. The rebel continues saying no to unjust cosmic order, whilst refusing to replace it with equally tyrannical human absolutes. This requires accepting the permanent discomfort of living without ultimate answers, holding fast to human values whilst acknowledging their provisional limited character. Such rebellion demands extraordinary intellectual honesty. The rebel must simultaneously affirm human moral intuitions strongly enough to reject cosmic injustice, whilst remaining humble enough to recognize the fallibility of those same intuitions. This creates a philosophy of limits rebellion that knows its boundaries, moral passion tempered by recognition of human finitude. The metaphysical rebel learns to revolt without becoming a revolutionary, to reject false absolutes without creating new ones, to maintain the original spark of moral outrage without letting it harden into ideological certainty. Historical rebellion marks a decisive transformation in human revolt, the moment when the metaphysical rejection of an unjust condition translates into concrete political action aimed at remaking the world entirely. Where the metaphysical rebel says no to God or cosmic order, the historical rebel says no to human society itself, demanding not merely personal freedom but universal justice, achieved through revolutionary transformation. The French Revolution provides Camus with the paradigmatic example of this transformation and its inherent dangers. Beginning with authentic revolt against genuine oppression, the Third Estate's rejection of aristocratic privilege, the demand for human dignity and equality, the revolution initially embodied the rebel's fundamental affirmation of human value. The Declaration of Rights proclaimed principles that emerged directly from rebellious consciousness, that humans possess inherent dignity, that society exists to protect this dignity, that tyranny violates the essential nature of human existence. Yet the revolution's trajectory reveals how historical rebellion becomes corrupted when it claims absolute knowledge of justice and historical necessity. The moderate phase, content with constitutional limits and gradual reform, gave way to radical Jacobinism that brooked no compromise with injustice. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety transformed rebellion into something qualitatively different, a systematic program to create perfect justice through the elimination of all obstacles, human or institutional, that stood in its way. This transformation occurred through a crucial philosophical shift that Camus identifies as rebellion's cardinal sin: the refusal to accept limits. Authentic revolt recognizes its own boundaries. It knows what it rejects, but remains humble about what perfect justice would entail. Historical rebellion, however, claims to know not only what is wrong with the present, but exactly what the future should look like. The Jacobins possessed a complete vision of the Republic of Virtue, and this certainty justified any means necessary to achieve it. Terror becomes inevitable once rebellion abandons its essential modesty. If we know with absolute certainty what justice requires, then those who oppose this vision are not merely mistaken, but enemies of humanity itself. The guillotine was not an unfortunate excess of revolutionary enthusiasm, but the logical consequence of absolute moral certainty. Each execution was performed in the name of virtue, each death justified by the perfect society it would help create. Camus reveals how this absolutism corrupts the means through contamination by absolutist ends. The revolution began by affirming human dignity against aristocratic contempt, but terror required treating present humans as expendable materials for constructing future humanity. The living person before the tribunal mattered less than the abstract citizen of tomorrow's republic. Revolutionary justice became indistinguishable from the arbitrary tyranny it had originally opposed. The pattern established by the French Revolution repeats throughout modern history whenever authentic grievances generate absolute solutions. The Russian Revolution began with genuine revolt against Tsarist oppression, but culminated in Stalinist terror that dwarfed anything the old regime had achieved. Fascist movements emerged from real social dislocations and national humiliations, but created systems of unprecedented brutality justified by visions of racial or national perfection. Each case follows the same trajectory. Authentic, rebellious consciousness confronts genuine injustice, but the refusal to accept limits transforms revolt into its opposite. The rebel, who began by affirming human dignity, ends by sacrificing actual humans to abstract humanity. The movement that started by rejecting arbitrary power creates new forms of arbitrariness more systematic than anything previously imagined. This betrayal occurs not through external corruption, but through internal logic. Once rebellion claims absolute knowledge of justice, it must eliminate everything that contradicts this knowledge. Compromise becomes collaboration with evil, moderation becomes complicity with oppression, doubt becomes treason against humanity's future. For Camus, artistic creation represents revolt in its purest and most complete form. Unlike political rebellion, which risks becoming absolute and thus betraying its own principles, artistic revolt creates human meaning without claiming eternal truth. The artist rebels against the given world, not by demanding its total transformation, but by creating new possibilities within the constraints of human existence. This creative act embodies the essence of revolt, the refusal to accept reality as final, whilst acknowledging the limits within which we must work. The artist confronts the same absurd condition as every human being: the silence of the universe, the inevitability of death, the absence of inherent meaning. Yet rather than succumbing to despair or fleeing into false absolutes, the artist transforms this confrontation into creation. Through the act of making something new, the artist asserts human dignity without claiming divine authority. The novel does not pretend to reveal ultimate truth about existence, but it creates a world where human values and experiences find expression. The painting does not claim to capture eternal beauty, but it manifests the artist's passionate engagement with colour, form, and vision. This creative rebellion operates within material constraints that mirror the human condition itself. The novelist works within the limits of language, the painter within the properties of pigment and canvas, the sculptor within the resistance of stone. These limitations do not represent failures, but opportunities for authentic creation. Just as human existence gains meaning through our response to mortality and finitude, artistic creation achieves significance through the artist's struggle with material constraints. The work emerges not despite these limits, but because of them, demonstrating how human dignity expresses itself precisely through our engagement with what resists us. Literature and art thus provide models for living authentically within absurd conditions. They show us how to create meaning without claiming eternal significance, how to affirm human values without pretending they possess cosmic authority. The tragic hero in drama faces impossible choices, yet maintains dignity through action. The lyric poem captures fleeting beauty without claiming it will last forever. These artistic achievements demonstrate that human life can be meaningful even when, especially when, we acknowledge its limits and mortality. Creative rebellion avoids the dangers that plague political absolutism because it never claims to possess final truth or demand total transformation of reality. The artist rebels through creation, not destruction. Rather than seeking to remake the world according to an abstract ideal, artistic revolt works with the materials at hand to produce something genuinely new. This creative process embodies revolt's essential affirmation of human possibility, whilst respecting the boundaries within which such possibility must be realized. Artistic creation thus represents the ideal synthesis of revolt, freedom, and passion that Camus sought throughout his philosophical development. It refuses reality as given through the creative act, exercises human freedom within acknowledged limits, and engages passionately with finite materials and possibilities. The artist neither accepts the world as it is nor demands it become something impossible, but creates new forms of meaning and beauty that expand human experience whilst remaining grounded in human reality. In this way, artistic rebellion offers a model for authentic existence that avoids both resignation and absolutism, demonstrating how human dignity expresses itself most fully through creative engagement with our absurd condition. Part 7. The Plague. Solidarity in face of suffering. The plague arrives in Oran like a revelation of the universe's fundamental character, not gradually, not with warning, but suddenly, inexplicably, transforming ordinary life into a confrontation with pure arbitrary suffering. Camus constructs his plague as the perfect embodiment of absurdity made manifest, a force that follows no moral logic, respects no human categories, and offers no meaningful pattern that might make it comprehensible to reason. The rats emerge from sewers, and die in streets, not because anyone deserves this fate, not because the city has committed some collective sin, but simply because this is what happens in a universe indifferent to human welfare and moral expectations. This arbitrariness cuts deeper than mere randomness. The plague strikes the virtuous and the corrupt alike, the young and the old, the prepared and the unprepared, revealing that suffering operates according to principles entirely alien to human notions of justice, meaning, or desert. Doctor. Rio watches children die whilst criminals survive, sees the devoted fall ill whilst the selfish remain healthy, and gradually understands that he confronts not evil in any comprehensible sense, but something far more disturbing, a force that simply does not recognize human categories at all. The plague becomes absurdity incarnate, not malevolent, but utterly indifferent, operating according to its own inexorable logic that bears no relationship to human hopes, fears, or moral frameworks. Under this pressure, the comfortable illusions that normally cushion human existence collapse with startling speed. The social conventions, the assumptions about progress and meaning, the belief that life follows some comprehensible pattern, all these dissolve when confronted with arbitrary suffering that demands immediate response without offering any framework for understanding. People discover that their previous certainties were largely constructed protective fictions that worked only so long as reality cooperated. The plague strips away these consoling stories, leaving individuals face to face with fundamental choices about how to respond when the universe reveals its true character. These extreme circumstances function like a philosophical laboratory, revealing authentic character more clearly than normal life ever could. When external supports disappear, when careers become meaningless, when social status offers no protection, when future plans become impossible, people must choose what truly matters to them. Some retreat into denial or fantasy. Others embrace nihilistic despair. But a few, like Rieu and Tarou, discover that they can choose solidarity and action even without hope for ultimate victory. The plague becomes not just a medical crisis, but a test of whether human beings can create meaning through their responses to meaninglessness. Camus crafts his plague as the perfect metaphor for the human condition itself. We live under the constant threat of arbitrary suffering that strikes without reason, follows no pattern we can decipher, and offers no promise of eventual resolution. Yet within this recognition lies the foundation of authentic ethics. When we understand that suffering is arbitrary rather than meaningful, we stop seeking justifications for action in external authorities or cosmic purposes. We act not because the universe demands it, not because we will ultimately triumph, but because we choose to affirm human dignity in the face of indifference. The plague teaches that revolt against absurd suffering requires no justification beyond our shared humanity. In the plague-stricken city of Oran, Doctor. Bernard Rieu practices medicine with a peculiar form of heroism, one that expects no victory, seeks no glory, and claims no ultimate meaning. His stethoscope becomes an instrument of absurd revolt, his medical bag a declaration of solidarity with suffering humanity. Rieu embodies what Camus considers the highest form of ethical action: commitment without illusion, engagement without hope of final triumph. Rieu's medical practice represents revolt in its purest form, not the dramatic gesture of the revolutionary, but the quiet, persistent refusal to accept suffering as natural or inevitable. Each morning he rises to treat patients he cannot ultimately save, in a plague he cannot definitively cure, within a universe that offers no guarantee of meaning or justice. Yet this apparent futility becomes the foundation of his ethics. That he continues precisely because the work itself, not its ultimate success, constitutes the moral act. His revolt lies not in defeating death, an impossible task, but in refusing to collaborate with it through indifference or despair. The ethics of presence that Rieu demonstrates requires no transcendent justification beyond the immediate reality of human pain. When faced with a child's agonizing death, he does not invoke divine purpose or historical necessity. Instead, he simply remains present, bearing witness to suffering whilst refusing to explain it away. This presence becomes a form of solidarity more profound than grand political gestures or heroic poses. It acknowledges the full weight of human vulnerability without retreating into comforting abstractions. Rieu's approach reveals how absurd philosophy translates into concrete moral action. He maintains the essential tension between recognizing life's fundamental meaninglessness and committing fully to human dignity. His medical practice becomes a daily exercise in this paradox, treating patients with complete dedication whilst acknowledging that all medical intervention merely postpones the inevitable. This is not cynicism but clarity, not despair but honest engagement with the human condition. The solidarity Rieu embodies emerges from shared recognition of mortality and suffering rather than shared beliefs about ultimate purpose. He works alongside others not because they agree about the meaning of their struggle, but because they all face the same fundamental vulnerability. This creates a form of human connection that requires no ideology, no promise of redemption, no appeal to higher authority. It rests entirely on the immediate, undeniable reality of human pain and the equally immediate response of compassion. Through Rieu, Camus demonstrates that ethical action requires neither hope for ultimate victory nor belief in transcendent meaning. The doctor's commitment to healing represents revolt against the absurd condition, not through denial or escape, but through full engagement with its implications. His presence with suffering others becomes both an acknowledgement of shared mortality and a refusal to let that mortality diminish human dignity. This is absurd ethics in practice, maintaining humanity precisely through accepting its limits. Tarrou represents perhaps the most admirable yet troubling character in The Plague, a man, seeking absolute moral purity in a world that permits no such thing. His quest for secular sainthood emerges from a devastating childhood experience, watching his father, a prosecutor, argue passionately for a death sentence, then witnessing the condemned man's execution. This moment shatters young Tarrou's world, revealing how easily good people participate in murder through institutional violence. From that day forward, he commits himself to an absolute principle: never, under any circumstances, to participate in killing or to justify the death of another human being. This commitment drives Tarrou's entire adult life. He joins revolutionary movements only to abandon them when they resort to violence. He refuses military service, rejects political solutions that require bloodshed, and dedicates himself to what he calls becoming a saint without God, achieving moral perfection through pure refusal to harm others. During the plague, this translates into tireless work with the sanitary squads, fighting death in its most arbitrary form whilst maintaining absolute respect for human life. Yet, Camus presents Tarrou's sainthood as both magnificent and problematic. His absolute commitment to non-violence represents a kind of moral perfectionism that paradoxically betrays the very spirit of revolt it seems to embody. Revolt, as Camus understands it, begins with recognition of human limits and imperfection is less than #0. 5# is greater than, it says, thus far and no further to injustice, whilst acknowledging that perfect justice remains impossible. Thoreau's quest for sainthood, however admirable, seeks to transcend these limits entirely. The tension emerges most clearly in contrast with Dr. Rieu, whose approach to fighting the plague accepts moral ambiguity. Rieu makes no claims to sainthood or moral purity. He simply works to reduce suffering, knowing that his efforts remain partial, temporary, and morally compromised. He cannot save everyone. He cannot eliminate death. He cannot even be certain his treatments help more than they harm. Yet he continues working because the alternative, accepting defeat, would betray human dignity more completely than accepting imperfection. Thoreau's absolutism, whilst beautiful in its integrity, risks becoming another form of the very absolutes that revolt must reject. His refusal to kill, taken to its logical extreme, might prevent him from stopping a murderer, protecting the innocent, or making the difficult choices that actual moral responsibility demands. Like the revolutionary ideologies he abandoned, his sainthood threatens to become a perfect system that sacrifices human complexity for moral clarity. This tension illuminates a crucial aspect of Camus's ethics. Even the most admirable moral aspirations must accept their own limits. The plague teaches that we cannot achieve perfect goodness any more than we can achieve perfect knowledge or perfect justice. What we can do is maintain solidarity with other imperfect humans, working together to reduce suffering whilst acknowledging our own complicity in the world's violence and absurdity. Thoreau's nobility lies not in his impossible quest for sainthood, but in his recognition that this quest itself must be pursued modestly without claiming final success or moral superiority over those who choose different forms of revolt. Part 8. Political Philosophy, Between Revolution and Reform. The great political tragedy of the 20th century, for Camus, lies not in the failure of good intentions, but in the success of a particular form of reasoning. Totalitarian movements, whether fascist or communist, share something more fundamental than their surface ideologies. They operate from a claim to absolute knowledge. This claim transforms political action from the modest work of improving human conditions into a cosmic mission to remake humanity itself. Consider how this logic unfolds. The movement declares it possesses scientific certainty about the direction of history, the true nature of human beings, and the inevitable shape of the future. Armed with this supposed knowledge, it can justify any present sacrifice for the sake of that glorious tomorrow. The individual human being, with all their particular needs and sufferings, becomes merely raw material for the construction of the new world. Present persons are expendable means to an abstract historical goal that transcends all immediate human concerns. This is why Camus sees fascism and communism as variations on the same essential error, despite their opposing content. Both movements have abandoned the original spirit of revolt, which begins with the recognition of human dignity and the refusal to accept injustice. True revolt emerges from witnessing concrete suffering and saying no to the conditions that create it. But absolute rebellion transforms this modest human gesture into a claim to remake existence itself. It loses sight of the actual human beings whose dignity first motivated the revolt. The totalitarian mind cannot tolerate uncertainty or limits. It demands complete solutions to the human condition, total explanations for historical development, and absolute methods for achieving perfection. This demand for totality inevitably leads to the sacrifice of real humans for abstract humanity. The peasant who resists collectivization, the intellectual who questions the party line, the ordinary citizen who simply wants to live their life, all become obstacles to historical necessity, enemies of the people's true interests, counter-revolutionary forces to be eliminated. Camus argues that the logical structure of this thinking matters more than its specific political content. Any movement that claims absolute truth about human destiny will eventually justify unlimited violence against those who stand in its way. The humanitarian goals become secondary to the maintenance of the system that supposedly serves those goals. The means contaminate and ultimately destroy the values they claim to serve. This is why Camus opposes totalitarian logic, even when it emerges from genuine concern for human suffering. The communist who begins with outrage at capitalist exploitation may end by creating new forms of oppression more systematic than anything that came before. The fascist who starts with legitimate grievances about national humiliation may end by destroying the very culture they claim to defend. The absolute rebel, having lost touch with the human limits that gave revolt its original meaning, becomes the enemy of the human dignity that first inspired their rebellion. The Algerian War presented Camus with the most agonizing political choice of his life, forcing him to confront the terrible gap between abstract moral principles and the concrete reality of human attachments. Born in Algeria to a working-class French family, Camus found himself caught between two equally compelling claims: the legitimate demand for independence by colonized Algerians and his visceral loyalty to the French Algerian community that included his mother, his friends, and the landscape of his childhood. This was no theoretical dilemma, but a lived contradiction that would define his final years and crystallize his understanding of political tragedy. When pressed by students at Stockholm University in 1957, shortly after receiving the Nobel Prize, Camus delivered his most controversial statement: "I have always condemned terror. I must also condemn a terrorism which is exercised blindly in the streets of Algiers, for example, and which someday could strike my mother or my family. I believe in justice, but I shall defend my mother above justice." These words scandalized the intellectual left, who saw them as a betrayal of anti-colonial solidarity. Yet they revealed something profound about the nature of political choice itself, that real politics involves not the application of abstract principles, but the navigation of competing human claims that cannot be perfectly reconciled. Camus refused the comfortable positions available to him. He could not embrace French nationalism, having witnessed firsthand the poverty and injustice inflicted upon Arab Algerians. Nor could he support the revolutionary violence of the FLN, which targeted civilians and threatened to destroy the community that had shaped him. Instead, he advocated for a federal solution that would protect both Arab and French Algerians whilst ending colonial domination. This position satisfied no one. French patriots condemned him as a traitor. Anti-colonial revolutionaries dismissed him as a nostalgic defender of privilege. Fellow intellectuals accused him of moral cowardice. The Algerian crisis illuminated the fundamental problem of political action, the impossibility of achieving perfect justice through imperfect means. Camus' ethics of revolt demanded solidarity with the oppressed, yet his understanding of human limits warned against the revolutionary absolutism that would sacrifice present human beings for future abstractions. He saw in Algeria the same pattern that had produced the the totalitarian disasters of the 20th century, the willingness to accept unlimited violence in service of supposedly unlimited justice. His refusal to choose between justice and his mother was not moral weakness but philosophical consistency, an affirmation that politics must remain bounded by immediate human relationships rather than transcendent ideals. This tragic position cost Camus dearly. He became increasingly isolated from the Parisian intellectual establishment, his reputation suffering amongst those who demanded clear political alignment. Yet his stance on Algeria exemplified the broader wisdom of his political philosophy, that genuine politics requires accepting the permanent tension between competing human claims, rather than resolving all conflicts through revolutionary transformation. The man who had explored the absurd condition in his early work now lived its political dimension, choosing to remain faithful to contradictory loyalties rather than escape into the false clarity of ideological commitment. Camus approached politics with the same unflinching honesty he brought to individual existence. Just as the absurd hero lives without hope of ultimate meaning, whilst refusing to surrender to nihilism, the authentic political actor must work for justice, whilst acknowledging its impossibility. This recognition transforms politics from a quest for perfect society into something more modest yet more human, the patient work of reducing actual suffering through practical, limited reforms. The revolutionary promises total transformation, the elimination of injustice itself. But this promise, however noble its intentions, rests on the same fundamental error that produces philosophical suicide, the belief that human reason can construct perfect solutions to the human condition. Revolution demands the sacrifice of present persons for future abstractions, treating today's suffering as acceptable collateral damage in service of tomorrow's utopia. Camus saw this logic at work in both fascist and communist movements, each willing to destroy human beings in the name of humanity. Reform appears less heroic, precisely because it accepts the tragic nature of political action. The reformer knows that poverty will persist, that injustice will find new forms, that every solution creates new problems. Yet this recognition of limits does not produce paralysis, but rather a different kind of commitment, one focused on immediate human welfare rather than ultimate historical goals. When we cannot eliminate suffering, we can still reduce it. When we cannot achieve perfect justice, we can still oppose particular injustices. This modest approach prevents the corruption of means by absolutist ends. The revolutionary, convinced of his cause's ultimate righteousness, justifies any method that serves the final goal. The reformer, accepting that no cause possesses ultimate righteousness, must justify each action on its own terms. Does this policy reduce actual harm? Does this reform respect human dignity? These questions matter more than whether the action advances some grand historical narrative. Such modesty requires genuine courage, the courage to work without the consolation of believing that history validates our efforts. The revolutionary acts with the certainty that future generations will vindicate present sacrifices. The reformer acts knowing that future generations may judge our efforts inadequate, that the problems we address will persist in new forms, that our victories will prove partial and temporary. Yet this uncertainty does not diminish the ethical imperative to act. It clarifies what authentic political action means. Camus found this approach more faithful to the human values that originally motivate political concern. We oppose injustice, not because we believe in perfect justice, but because we witness particular suffering. We work for reform, not because we expect to create paradise, but because we recognize our solidarity with those who suffer now. These immediate human motivations prove more reliable than abstract principles precisely because they remain connected to lived experience rather than theoretical constructions. This represents the application of absurd ethics to collective action, maintaining tension between recognition of limits and commitment to improvement without false hope for perfect solutions. Just as Sisyphus finds meaning in the struggle itself rather than in any ultimate achievement, the modest politician finds purpose in the ongoing work of reform rather than in revolutionary transformation. The rock will always roll back down the mountain, but each push upward matters for its own sake, not as part of some final victory over gravity itself. Part 9. Mediterranean Thinking, an alternative to European nihilism. The Mediterranean mind possesses something that Northern European philosophy has repeatedly lost: the capacity to live fully within human limitations, without despair or the desperate need for transcendent escape. This is not resignation but wisdom, a clear-sighted recognition that human flourishing happens within constraints, not by transcending them. Where German idealism sought the absolute and Christian thought promised otherworldly salvation, Mediterranean culture developed what Camus saw as a more honest and ultimately more life-affirming approach to the human condition. Greek tragedy exemplifies this wisdom perfectly. When Oedipus discovers his fate, he doesn't curse the gods or seek escape through philosophical systems that promise ultimate meaning. He accepts the terrible knowledge and continues to act with dignity within the constraints of his situation. The tragic hero embodies the Mediterranean understanding that nobility comes not from overcoming human limits, but from how we conduct ourselves within them. This is why Camus found in Greek tragedy a model for the absurd hero. Both accept their situation without false consolation whilst maintaining their essential humanity. This wisdom extends beyond individual psychology to encompass an entire philosophical orientation. Mediterranean thought, from the pre-Socratics through the Stoics, consistently emphasized measure and proportion. The Greeks spoke of sophrosyne, a kind of wise moderation that recognized the proper bounds of human action and desire. This wasn't timidity, but insight into what actually constitutes human flourishing. They understood that the attempt to exceed natural limits leads not to greatness, but to hubris and inevitable destruction. Christianity introduced a profound rupture in this tradition by promising transcendence of the human condition itself. The Christian seeks salvation from mortality, from suffering, from the very constraints that define human existence. This otherworldly orientation, Camus argued, represents a fundamental betrayal of human dignity because it declares our natural condition inadequate and seeks escape rather than excellence within given parameters. The Mediterranean alternative accepts mortality, embraces the earth, and finds meaning in human relationships and creative expression rather than divine promises. Modern European thought, despite its secular pretensions, inherited Christianity's Promethean ambitions. From Hegel's absolute spirit to Marx's classless society, European philosophy continued seeking total solutions to the human condition. The result has been a series of totalitarian temptations, political movements that promise to remake humanity itself, rather than working within the constraints of human nature. Camus saw, in Mediterranean wisdom, an antidote to these dangerous absolutes. The wisdom of limits doesn't lead to passivity, but to a different kind of action. When we accept that we cannot achieve perfect justice, we work for whatever justice remains possible. When we acknowledge that we cannot eliminate suffering, we focus on reducing unnecessary suffering. This approach avoids both nihilistic despair, which concludes that if perfect solutions are impossible, nothing matters, and totalitarian hope, which sacrifices present human beings for imagined future perfection. Mediterranean wisdom finds the middle path, accepting reality whilst refusing to be crushed by it, working for improvement whilst rejecting impossible dreams. This philosophy of limits becomes particularly relevant in our contemporary moment. We face ecological constraints that demand we learn to live within natural boundaries rather than constantly expanding our dominion over nature. We confront political challenges that require compromise and gradual progress rather than revolutionary transformation. Mediterranean wisdom offers resources for navigating these challenges without falling into either cynical withdrawal or dangerous utopianism. It teaches us that human dignity lies not in transcending our condition, but in how gracefully and courageously we inhabit it. Camus understood that geography shapes philosophy in ways more profound than mere cultural preference. His distinction between Mediterranean and Northern European thought reveals fundamentally different approaches to the human condition itself. Where Northern ideologies consistently seek to transcend natural limits through systematic thought, revolutionary transformation, or otherworldly salvation, Mediterranean wisdom accepts the body, the earth, and the constraints they impose as the very foundation of authentic existence. This geographical metaphor illuminates a crucial philosophical divide. German idealism, with its systematic totalities and absolute knowledge, represents the northern impulse to overcome finitude through pure thought. Christianity promises transcendence of bodily existence through eternal salvation. Revolutionary utopianism seeks to abolish human limitations through historical transformation. Each shares the same fundamental structure: the denial that natural constraints define rather than limit human possibility. Solar thinking operates from entirely different premises. It begins with acceptance of what Camus calls the body and the earth, the irreducible facts of mortality, sensual experience, and natural cycles that Northern thought consistently attempts to escape. Mediterranean philosophy doesn't seek to overcome these limitations, but to discover within them the sources of human dignity and joy. The sun becomes a symbol not of transcendent illumination, but of present warmth, immediate light, the actual conditions under which human life unfolds. Consider how this distinction plays out in approaches to suffering and death. Northern ideologies typically respond to human finitude by constructing elaborate systems that promise its eventual overcoming, whether through rational progress, spiritual salvation, or revolutionary transformation. Mediterranean thinking acknowledges suffering and death as permanent features of existence, whilst finding within this acknowledgement the grounds for solidarity and revolt. The difference isn't merely temperamental but philosophical. One approach denies natural limits, the other builds ethics upon their acceptance. This geographical philosophy provides resources for contemporary problems precisely because it offers an alternative to both nihilistic despair and ideological fanaticism. When systematic solutions fail, as Camus argues, they inevitably must we face the choice between despairing cynicism and renewed fanaticism. Mediterranean thinking suggests a third path: the patient cultivation of human values within acknowledged limits, the solar acceptance of what we are, rather than the northern obsession with what we might become through systematic transformation. The political implications prove equally significant. Northern ideologies, whether fascist or communist, share the conviction that human nature and social relations can be fundamentally transformed through the application of systematic principles. Mediterranean humanism recognizes that politics, like individual existence, operates within natural constraints that systematic thinking cannot abolish. This leads not to political passivity, but to what Camus calls modest, revolt-sustained opposition to injustice that doesn't promise ultimate solutions, but insists on immediate human dignity. The final synthesis in Camus' philosophy emerges not through theoretical arguments, but through lived wisdom, the recognition that seeing clearly and loving deeply are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of human maturity. This union represents his most profound response to the absurd condition, neither the blind optimism that refuses to acknowledge life's harsh realities, nor the cynical detachment that uses clarity as an excuse for withdrawal from engagement. Mature wisdom, for Camus, demands we see reality without the consoling filters of ideology or faith. We acknowledge death's finality, suffering's reality, and meaning's absence, while simultaneously embracing life with passionate intensity. This is not contradiction, but completion. The lucid person understands precisely what they affirm when they choose love over indifference, solidarity over isolation, creation over destruction. Their engagement carries the weight of full knowledge rather than the lightness of illusion. Love of life, in this mature vision, requires no external justification. The immediate experience of Mediterranean sunlight on skin, the touch of another human being, the simple fact of conscious existence itself, these provide their own validation. Camus discovered that once we abandon the demand that life justify itself through reference to transcendent purpose or eternal meaning, we become free to appreciate what actually exists, rather than mourning what never was. The orange tree blooms not because it serves some cosmic plan, but because blooming is its nature. Human love and creativity operate according to the same logic of immanent value. Lucidity about limits enhances rather than diminishes our capacity for joy, precisely because it eliminates the exhausting burden of impossible expectations. When we no longer demand that life provide ultimate meaning, we can appreciate the meanings it actually offers. When we stop insisting that love be eternal, we can fully experience its present intensity. When we cease requiring justice to be guaranteed by the universe, we can commit ourselves more completely to creating it within human community. Clear sight reveals not life's poverty, but its abundance, an abundance previously hidden by our insistence that it be something other than what it is. This synthesis represents Camus' ultimate response to absurdity, informed love that sees clearly and affirms anyway. It is neither the leap of faith that closes its eyes to difficulty, nor the paralysis of despair that uses insight as justification for inaction. Instead, it embodies what we might call lucid affirmation, the mature recognition that life's lack of ultimate justification does not diminish its immediate value, that mortality does not negate beauty, that the absence of cosmic purpose does not eliminate human purpose. The union of lucidity and love provides the foundation for all of Camus's mature philosophy. His ethics emerges from this synthesis. We act justly, not because justice is guaranteed eternal significance, but because we love humanity enough to create meaning through solidarity. His politics follows the same pattern. We oppose oppression, not because victory is assured, but because lucid love demands we defend human dignity against forces that would crush it. Even his aesthetics reflects this union. Art matters not because it reveals transcendent truth, but because it expresses and celebrates the human capacity to create beauty in full knowledge of its fragility. This is acceptance without resignation, engagement without illusion. Camus discovered that the deepest wisdom lies not in choosing between seeing clearly and loving deeply, but in recognizing their essential unity in any life worth living. Part 10. Death and the Human Condition. The absurd emerges most clearly when consciousness confronts its own mortality. Camus recognized that death stands as the ultimate source of the tension between human demand for meaning and the universe's indifferent silence. We are creatures who desperately seek lasting significance whilst inhabiting bodies destined for dissolution. This consciousness of mortality creates the fundamental contradiction that defines the human condition. We are beings who can conceive of eternity, yet are bound by time, who demand permanence, whilst everything we touch crumbles. Death renders all human projects ultimately futile, yet consciousness persists in demanding that our actions matter beyond their immediate effects. We build civilizations knowing they will fall, create art knowing it will fade, love knowing loss is inevitable. The absurd lies not in death itself, but in our awareness of it combined with our inability to accept meaninglessness. Animals face mortality without existential anguish because they lack the consciousness that transforms biological facts into philosophical crisis. Only humans experience the peculiar suffering of knowing we shall die while simultaneously demanding that our lives possess eternal significance. This consciousness of mortality distinguishes human existence from mere biological survival. Where other creatures simply live and die, we live knowing we shall die, and this knowledge transforms every moment into a confrontation with finitude. Yet Camus argued that this same awareness grants us unique dignity. The recognition of mortality becomes the foundation of authentic living because it strips away illusions about permanence and forces us to confront what truly matters within the boundaries of our brief existence. Death cannot be overcome through philosophical reasoning or heroic action. Every attempt to transcend mortality through thought or deed ultimately fails, yet consciousness continues to rebel against this limitation. The absurd hero must integrate mortality into their understanding without falling into despair or false hope. Death becomes not an enemy to defeat, but a condition to acknowledge, the source of urgency that gives weight to human choice and action. This acceptance transforms the meaning of human endeavor. Freed from impossible demands for permanence, our actions become valuable for their own sake rather than their lasting results. The knowledge that we shall die does not diminish the significance of how we choose to live. Rather, it concentrates that significance into the present moment. Mortality creates the conditions within which authentic revolt becomes possible. Not revolt against death itself, but revolt against the meaninglessness that death seems to impose upon existence. Camus pushes beyond mere acceptance of the human condition towards something far more demanding and transformative, amor fati, the active love of one's fate. This represents revolt in its most mature and paradoxical form. Rather than simply enduring the limitations of mortality, finitude, and meaninglessness, Camus calls us to embrace these very conditions as the source of life's intensity and preciousness. We must learn to love, not despite our tragic circumstances, but precisely because of them. This philosophical stance emerges from Camus' recognition that our limitations are not obstacles to overcome, but the very conditions that make human experience possible. Death gives urgency, to our choices. Finitude creates the scarcity that makes moments matter. The absence of predetermined meaning forces us to create value through our own commitment and passion. Without these constraints, human life would dissolve into an endless, weightless expanse devoid of significance or intensity. The love of fate transforms what initially appears as life's greatest burdens into its deepest sources of meaning. Mortality becomes not the enemy of fulfillment, but its essential condition. We treasure what we know we will lose. We invest ourselves fully in projects precisely because they are temporary. The knowledge that our time is limited compels us to choose carefully, to act with conviction, to love without reservation. Camus shows us that attempting to escape these conditions through false hopes of immortality or transcendence actually diminishes rather than enhances human experience. This represents the culmination of absurd philosophy, complete integration of lucid recognition with passionate affirmation. We see clearly that existence offers no ultimate justification, no final redemption, no escape from the fundamental contradictions of the human condition. Yet we respond not with despair or withdrawal, but with an intensified commitment to life itself. This requires no external validation, no promise of reward beyond the grave, no assurance that our struggles serve some cosmic purpose. Camus's famous declaration that the struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart captures this transformation perfectly. Fulfillment comes not from achieving some final goal, but from the process of striving itself. The mountain climber finds meaning not at the summit, but in the climb. The artist discovers purpose not in completing the masterpiece, but in the daily discipline of creation. The lover experiences transcendence not in possessing the beloved, but in the act of loving. This amor fati represents revolt against the deepest form of resentment, the wish that reality were fundamentally different than it is. Most philosophical and religious systems spring from this resentment, promising escape from the tragic structure of human existence. Camus demands instead that we learn to love this structure, to find in our very limitations the source of our dignity and our joy. Only then do we achieve genuine freedom. Not freedom from the human condition, but freedom within it. Freedom to create meaning and beauty precisely because we know they will not last forever. Part 11, Art and Creation, the aesthetic dimension of revolt. Art occupies a unique position in Camus's philosophy of revolt, representing perhaps the most pure expression of human rebellion against the absurd condition. The artist confronts the fundamental tension between human need for meaning and the world's indifferent silence. Yet rather than fleeing into false transcendence or accepting passive submission, creates something genuinely new. This creative act embodies revolt in its most authentic form. The artist appears to escape reality by constructing alternative worlds that follow human logic rather than natural law. Yet genuine art neither accepts the given world passively, nor retreats into pure fantasy. Instead, it transforms the materials of existence whilst remaining grounded in human experience. The novelist does not simply reproduce life as found, nor does the painter merely copy visible surfaces. They reshape reality according to human vision, imposing form and meaning where none existed before. This transformation constitutes rebellion not against existence itself, but against existence as merely given, unformed, meaningless. Artistic creation reveals revolt's essential paradox. It rejects reality as sufficient whilst accepting the materials and limitations within which all creation must work. The sculptor rebels against the formless stone, yet cannot work without it. The writer refuses language as merely utilitarian communication, yet depends entirely upon words and their conventional meanings. This tension generates authentic creation, neither pure acceptance nor pure rejection, but transformation through engagement. The creative act demonstrates absurd living at its most complete. Artists create meaning through the process of creation itself, not by seeking external validation or eternal significance for their works. They know their creations will perish, that no transcendent authority guarantees their value, yet they continue creating because the act itself justifies existence. This mirrors the absurd hero's condition, fully conscious of mortality and meaninglessness, yet committed to living with maximum intensity and authenticity. Art represents revolt in its purest form, because it refuses reality as given whilst accepting the conditions within which revolt must operate. Unlike political revolution, which seeks to change external circumstances, or philosophical systems, which attempt to explain away absurdity, artistic creation acknowledges limitation whilst transcending it through form. The artist creates meaning without claiming cosmic significance, imposes human order without denying natural chaos, achieves immortality through works that will themselves die. This creative revolt provides a model for authentic response to absurd conditions. Art demonstrates that human meaning-making requires no transcendent justification. The act of creation itself suffices. Through artistic transformation, consciousness discovers its capacity to generate value from within, to create significance through engagement rather than receiving it from external authority. The aesthetic dimension of revolt thus reveals possibilities for authentic existence that neither philosophical suicide nor political revolution can provide. Literature occupies a unique position in philosophical inquiry, one that Camus understood with particular clarity. Where abstract argument might outline the logical structure of an idea, the novel dramatizes its lived reality. Characters must actually inhabit philosophical positions, revealing their texture, their contradictions, their human cost in ways that pure theory cannot capture. For Camus, fiction became not merely a vehicle for expressing predetermined conclusions, but a laboratory for testing ideas against the full complexity of human experience. Consider Meursault in The Stranger, whose indifference to social conventions and emotional expectations embodies one possible response to absurdity. Through his consciousness, we experience what it might actually feel like to live without the comforting illusions that most people require. His detachment from his mother's funeral, his casual relationship with Marie, his matter-of-fact acceptance of his own execution. These are not theoretical positions, but lived realities we inhabit through the novel's perspective. The reader discovers, alongside Meursault, that such radical honesty about meaninglessness carries both liberation and profound isolation. Yet Camus's novels function as genuine investigations precisely because they refuse to present simple answers. Dr. Rieux in The Plague embodies a different response to absurdity, not Meursault's detached acceptance, but active revolt against suffering, even whilst acknowledging the ultimate futility of the struggle. Through Rieux's dedication to treating plague victims, knowing he cannot ultimately defeat the plague itself, we experience the dignity and exhaustion of revolt. The novel tests this position rigorously, showing both its nobility and its costs. Tarou represents yet another possibility, the saint without God, seeking moral perfection whilst rejecting transcendent justification. His conversations with Ryu explore whether such sainthood is possible or desirable, whether the pursuit of absolute innocence might itself become a form of violence. These are not abstract debates, but lived tensions within a character we come to know intimately. The novel form itself embodies absurd principles in its very structure. Every narrative creates meaning through artistic organisation, plot, character development, thematic resonance, whilst remaining fundamentally arbitrary in its choices. Why does Meursault shoot the Arab on the beach rather than walk away? The novel provides psychological and circumstantial reasons, but ultimately, the choice serves the artistic investigation Camus pursues. This tension between meaningful structure and arbitrary foundation mirrors the human condition itself. We create significance whilst acknowledging its groundlessness. Fiction reveals what philosophy often obscures, that ideas have emotional weight, that intellectual positions carry psychological consequences, that abstract principles must be lived by actual people in concrete circumstances. When Ryu tends to plague victims knowing his efforts are ultimately meaningless, we feel the weight of that contradiction in ways that purely theoretical discussion of Revolt cannot convey. The novel makes philosophy immediate, visceral, inescapable. Through this literary investigation, Camus discovered that philosophical positions, which seem coherent in abstract formulation, often reveal unexpected complexities when dramatized through character and situation. The novels become spaces where ideas encounter their own limitations, where theoretical positions meet the full messiness of human experience and must prove their viability, not through logical consistency alone, but through their capacity to sustain actual lives. Aesthetic experience offers something extraordinary in Camus's philosophy, immediate justification for existence that requires no theoretical scaffolding, no transcendent validation, no elaborate philosophical argument. When we encounter genuine beauty, whether in art, nature, or human creation, we experience what Camus calls a direct affirmation of life that needs no external support. The sunset over the Mediterranean, the precise architecture of a Greek temple, the haunting melody that stops us in our tracks, these moments justify themselves completely. They ask nothing of eternity, demand no cosmic purpose, require no divine sanction. They simply are, and in being, they make existence worthwhile. This aesthetic justification emerges precisely from the tension between human consciousness and natural reality, not despite it. Beauty doesn't transcend the absurd condition, it embodies it perfectly. Consider how we respond to a piece of music that moves us deeply. The melody exists in physical vibrations, mathematical relationships, acoustic phenomena that care nothing for human meaning. Yet consciousness transforms these indifferent sound waves into something that speaks directly to our deepest longings, our sense of what life might mean. This transformation doesn't resolve the absurd. It demonstrates how human awareness can create meaning from meaninglessness, significance from indifference. Camus recognized that artistic beauty affirms life by revealing possibilities for meaning within absurd conditions rather than offering escape from them. The greatest art doesn't promise salvation or transcendence. It shows us how to live fully whilst acknowledging life's fundamental contradictions. Greek tragedy exemplifies this perfectly. It confronts suffering, fate, and human limitation directly, yet transforms these harsh realities into something beautiful something that makes us grateful to be alive, even in the face of inevitable defeat. The tragic hero doesn't escape the human condition, but demonstrates how to inhabit it with dignity and grace. The creation and appreciation of beauty represent specifically human responses to cosmic indifference. When we create art, compose music, write poetry, or simply arrange flowers in a vase, we assert human dignity through creative transformation. We take the raw materials of an indifferent universe, stone, sound, colour, language, and shape them into forms that speak to human consciousness. This creative act doesn't deny cosmic indifference, but transforms it into the very condition that makes human creativity possible and precious. Aesthetic justification differs fundamentally from both religious and philosophical justifications because it remains immediate, concrete, and tied to sensuous experience rather than abstract argument or transcendent faith. Religious justification locates meaning in divine purpose. Philosophical justification seeks rational foundations for existence. But aesthetic justification works through direct encounter, the immediate recognition that this painting, this poem, this moment of natural beauty makes life worth living. No argument is needed, no faith required. The experience carries its own complete validation, offering what Camus calls reasons for living that emerge from life itself, rather than from theories about life. Part 12. The Philosophy of Limits. Wisdom for Finite Beings. Human greatness emerges not from transcending limits, but from working magnificently within them. Camus understood that finitude initially strikes us as pure constraint, the cruel boundaries that prevent us from achieving everything we desire, from living forever, from knowing absolute truth. Yet this apparent limitation creates the very conditions that make human life meaningful and human achievements possible. Without death, there would be no urgency to love deeply or create boldly. Without ignorance, there would be no wonder driving scientific discovery. Without moral uncertainty, there would be no courage required for ethical action. Finitude doesn't diminish human possibility, it creates it. The sculptor works within the constraints of marble, the poet within the limits of language, the lover within the span of a lifetime. These boundaries don't imprison creativity, they make it necessary and beautiful. The tragedy of modern thought lies in its persistent attempt to exceed human limits through absolute systems of knowledge or revolutionary programs promising perfect societies. Camus recognized that such attempts invariably destroy the humanity they claim to enhance. The revolutionary who sacrifices present lives for future perfection, the philosopher who reduces human complexity to abstract principles, the ideologist who demands total commitment to partial truths, all commit the same fundamental error. They mistake human finitude for a problem to be solved, rather than a condition to be embraced. When we accept our limits, something remarkable happens. Energy previously wasted on impossible dreams becomes available for achievable goods. Instead of seeking perfect justice, we work for particular improvements. Instead of demanding absolute meaning, we create provisional purposes. Instead of pursuing immortal fame, we cherish temporary connections. This isn't resignation, but liberation, the freedom that comes from aligning our efforts with reality rather than fighting against the structure of existence itself. Embracing finitude represents the mature development of absurd philosophy. The absurd begins with recognizing the gap between human longing and world silence. But rather than seeking transcendence that would eliminate human nature entirely, we learn to find fulfillment within the gap itself. We become fully human not by escaping our limits, but by inhabiting them completely, creating meaning and beauty precisely because not despite our mortality, uncertainty, and moral complexity. The philosophy of limits teaches us that wisdom lies not in reaching beyond ourselves, but in becoming authentically what we are. At the heart of Camus' philosophical project lies a devastating critique of absolute thinking, the human tendency to claim access to total truth, perfect justice, or complete understanding that transcends our finite perspective. This critique emerges not from skepticism about truth itself, but from recognition that all human knowledge remains partial, provisional, and bounded by the conditions of our existence. When we forget these limits, Camus argues, we inevitably betray the very human experience we claim to serve. Absolute thinking manifests itself in countless forms. The revolutionary, who believes history has revealed its final destination. The moralist, who claims perfect knowledge of good and evil. The philosopher, who constructs systems pretending to explain everything. Each represents the same fundamental error, the belief that human beings can step outside their finite condition to grasp reality from some God's eye view. This pretension to totality doesn't merely represent intellectual overreach, it becomes the foundation for the most dangerous forms of violence. The violence inherent in absolutism stems from its treatment of human limitation. When we claim access to absolute truth or perfect justice, those who disagree with us cannot simply hold different perspectives. They must embody the very limits and imperfections that our absolute vision denies. Their existence becomes a reproach to our certainty. They represent the stubborn particularity of human experience that refuses to conform to our universal schemes. In this light, disagreement appears not as natural human difference, but as a form of evil that must be eliminated. This dynamic explains why the most idealistic movements often produce the most systematic cruelties. The revolutionary who has glimpsed the perfect society cannot tolerate those who fail to share this vision. Their resistance proves they are enemies of human happiness itself. The religious believer who has received absolute revelation cannot accept that others might legitimately see differently. Their unbelief represents willful blindness to divine truth. In each case, the claim to absolute knowledge transforms ordinary human disagreement into cosmic warfare between good and evil. Camus proposes a different approach, modest thinking that accepts uncertainty and incompleteness as permanent features of the human condition rather than temporary obstacles to overcome. This intellectual humility doesn't represent defeat, but wisdom recognition that our finite perspectives, whilst limited, remain genuinely valuable precisely because they emerge from lived human experience. We can know things truly without knowing them completely. We can act justly without possessing perfect justice. We can create meaning without requiring cosmic validation. This modest approach enables genuine dialogue between different perspectives by acknowledging the partial character of all human viewpoints. When I recognize that my understanding remains incomplete, I can listen to yours not as a threat to my certainty, but as a potential enrichment of my limited vision. When you acknowledge the provisional nature of your convictions, we can engage in real conversation rather than mutual proselytizing. Neither of us possesses the whole truth, but together we might glimpse more of it than either could alone. The critique of absolute thinking provides the foundation for Camus's entire political philosophy. He rejects totalitarian solutions, not because he lacks commitment to human welfare, but because he recognizes that claims to perfect knowledge inevitably justify perfect oppression. The communist who has discovered the laws of history, the fascist who has identified the master race, the technocrat who has calculated optimal social arrangements, each represents the same dangerous pattern of absolute thinking applied to politics. Yet this rejection of absolutes doesn't lead to paralysis or relativism. Camus maintains passionate commitment to reducing human suffering and increasing human dignity, whilst acknowledging that we possess no final blueprint for the perfect society. We can oppose injustice without claiming perfect knowledge of justice. We can work for human liberation without pretending to know exactly what liberated humanity would look like. The absurd universe offers no eternal guarantees, no cosmic validation for our moral choices. Yet this absence of absolute foundation does not collapse human values into arbitrary preference or nihilistic indifference. Camus discovers something more subtle and more honest, values that emerge from the human condition itself, relative to our shared situation, yet binding precisely because they arise from what we actually are, rather than what we imagine we ought to be, according to some transcendent standard. These relative values possess genuine force because they spring from the concrete realities of human existence. When we recognize our common vulnerability to suffering, our shared confrontation with death, our mutual dependence on solidarity for dignity and meaning, we create obligations that carry real weight, not because they reflect eternal moral law, but because they emerge from the irreducible facts of what it means to be human in an absurd world. The mother protecting her child acts from values that are relative to human nature and human needs, yet this relativity makes her commitment more authentic, not less binding, than if she acted from abstract duty to cosmic principle. Solidarity becomes the foundation for these relative values precisely because it acknowledges our finite condition whilst refusing to surrender human dignity. We cannot ground our ethics in God, reason, or nature as absolute authorities, but we can ground them in the recognition that we face the absurd together, that our revolt against meaninglessness gains strength and authenticity when it becomes collective rather than solitary. The values that emerge from this solidarity, justice, compassion, resistance to oppression, are relative to our shared human situation, yet they provide reliable guidance because they arise from the deepest truths about our condition. This relativity does not mean arbitrariness, because human nature and human situations create genuine constraints on what values can emerge and flourish. We cannot successfully build ethics on pure selfishness, because humans are social beings who require cooperation and recognition. We cannot base lasting values on cruelty, because it contradicts our capacity for empathy and solidarity. The relative values that prove durable and meaningful are those that acknowledge both our limitations and our possibilities, that work with rather than against the grain of human experience in an absurd universe. The culmination of Camus' ethical thinking lies in this recognition that we can find genuine moral guidance without false absolutes or nihilistic relativism. Our values remain provisional, open to revision, as our understanding deepens and our circumstances change. Yet this provisional character makes them more honest and ultimately more reliable than values that claim eternal validity whilst ignoring the concrete realities of human existence. In accepting the relativity of our values whilst maintaining their genuine binding force, we achieve the mature ethical stance that the absurd condition demands. Neither the false comfort of absolute certainty nor the despair of complete meaninglessness, but the difficult wisdom of living authentically within our limits. Part 13. Conclusion. We have traced the complete arc of Albert Camus' philosophical vision, from the stark recognition of the absurd through the development of an ethics grounded in revolt, solidarity, and human dignity. What emerges is not merely a collection of insights, but a systematic philosophy that begins with unflinching honesty about meaninglessness and builds toward ethical engagement, without false consolations or absolute claims. Camus achieved something remarkable in 20th century thought. He created a coherent framework that integrates individual authenticity with collective responsibility, personal revolt with political modesty, lucid awareness with passionate engagement. The absurd man who begins by recognizing life's fundamental meaninglessness does not retreat into solipsistic despair, but discovers, in that very recognition, the foundation for solidarity with others who share the human condition. The rebel who says no to oppression simultaneously affirms the dignity of all human beings. The artist who creates beauty without eternal guarantees nonetheless adds something precious to the world. This integration resolves what might seem like contradictions in Camus's thought. How can one maintain hope whilst acknowledging futility? How can one commit passionately to justice whilst rejecting absolute truth? How can one love deeply whilst accepting mortality? Camus shows these are not contradictions, but complementary aspects of mature human existence. Hope becomes more authentic when stripped of false guarantees. Commitment gains power when freed from fanatical certainty. Love deepens when embraced as finite and precious rather than eternal. The philosophy of limits offers a genuine alternative to both nihilistic despair and ideological fanaticism. Against nihilism, Camus demonstrates that meaning can be created through human action even without cosmic purpose. Against fanaticism, he shows that commitment need not require absolute truth or perfect solutions. The Mediterranean sensibility, he championed that balance of lucidity and passion, restraint and engagement, provides wisdom for living in an age of broken certainties. Camus's enduring relevance lies in his recognition that human dignity emerges not despite our limitations, but through them. Mortality makes life precious rather than meaningless. Uncertainty creates space for freedom rather than paralysis. Vulnerability becomes the foundation for solidarity rather than isolation. The very conditions that might seem to diminish human significance actually constitute its source. For contemporary life, Camus offers practical guidance for maintaining hope without false optimism, commitment without fanaticism, and love without illusion. In our current historical moment marked by climate crisis, political polarization, and technological disruption, his voice remains essential. He teaches us to act with full awareness of our limits, to rebel against injustice without claiming perfect knowledge, to create meaning through solidarity rather than seeking it in transcendent purpose. The complete philosophy of Albert Camus thus presents not merely an intellectual system, but a way of living, clear-eyed about reality's harshness, yet committed to human dignity, modest about our knowledge, yet passionate in our engagement, accepting of death, yet devoted to life. In learning to live without hope of salvation, whilst never ceasing to act for human flourishing, we discover that the absurd condition is not humanity's curse, but its glory.